Hello and welcome to part 4 of how to paint this Raven Guard Space Marine from Games Workshop. So in this video we're going to be looking at how to paint the scroll work between the legs. Well, I say scroll work, it's a purity seal. And it's going to be kind of a very worn, battered looking purity seal, so it's seen a lot of service. You can see on the wet palette there's quite a few colours there. Don't worry, you don't need all those colours. This is the same wet palette that I've used to paint the non-metallic gold on the chest. So we're going to start off with using English uniform, so that's the same base colour. I'm just using downward brush marks, and the reason for that is it allows the brush to skip over some of the shadowed creases and things like that. It just makes it a bit easier later on when you pick them out. You don't have to be super neat at this point. You're not looking for a perfect coverage. In fact, it probably helps a little bit if it looks a bit patchy in places. For those of you interested, I'm using a size 0 artist opus brush, but you don't have to go that small. Size 1 or 2 is perfectly fine. Now you did see me use Ushabti bone. That's the colour in the middle at the bottom, that's almost just off the bottom actually of the wet palette. I didn't need to use that for a start, I picked the wrong colour. so don't worry about that, but I'm using it now just to pick out some of the details to just to highlight them. It's not going to be the final stage highlight or anything like that at this point. It's just to move you along in the stages to pick out the details. This is, as I mentioned, it's going to be a very battered looking purity seal. If you look at the artwork on the Games Workshop one, they've gone for a much cleaner looking purity seal, and you don't get to see much in the way of the folds and things of the material because of the way that I'm painting the model. Although it's not dirty as such, it's still quite worn and obviously used. I want that same kind of feeling for this purity seal. So here it's just a stage simply of picking out the folds. There's actually quite a lot of folds that you might not realise from seeing the painted version. So if you don't want quite as many folds to be visible, just paint them as flat, and the paint will kind of hide the detail a little bit. And the reason you might want to do that is because it will allow you to more clearly paint the text when I put it on. With the way that I paint the text on, I'm not so concerned about it looking like flowery lettering with all kind of extended lines and things like that. I just use very tiny dots because to try and make it look more realistic in the scale, because obviously text at that size would be pretty much invisible. But if you wanted to paint like large symbols and letters and things like that on it, then you probably want the purity seal to look a bit cleaner, just because it'll be much easier to see them. But for the technique and style that I'm going for, having it a bit dirty actually helps in a way to make the lettering look even smaller and more, more detailed. So you can see here, I haven't actually changed colours at all. I'm just slowly building it up, and the build-up is just from very delicate layers. It's kind of almost glazing, but it's like thick glazing because there's so little amount of paint on the brush, and it's so delicately applied that it doesn't leave a very hard mark. So you can but it's just kind of thick enough that you build up the layers quicker, whereas if you were glazing this, it would for one, it would look a lot smoother, but also it would take a much longer time to get all those layers down. And the reason that I don't want it to look quite so smooth is because again, it's adding to that kind of ratty, tattered look. Now, the hardest part actually about this purity seal is the second strip underneath the main strip, because that will also need text on it, but you can't. Well, this is mainly for people that are right-handed. It's difficult. If you're left-handed, then you can go from right to left and it's not so bad. But having said that, you still need the beginning dots. I'll go over this more actually when we get to that stage, but when you put the text on, you need the first letter or the first word that you kind of want to represent with the marks. That needs to be the strongest, most visible on the line, so it looks like that, you know, what if you want it to represent kind of like English or European type text work. And also for the underlaying strip there, it's quite important just to pick out the edges a bit, just to give some definition. So just doing a kind of a soft edge highlight. Don't do the edge highlight lighter than, you know, don't go for white and put an edge highlight down as a highlight. It's just for definition, so it wants to be the same colour as the folds. So here you can see I went and I've used a bit of Mornfang Brown. But it again is more like a glaze. You don't want to wipe out the colours, it's just to kind of blend them in and again make it look sort of dirty. But I will go over it more and more as we go along. So the highlight balance will change as I decide how much, you know, how light or dark I need it to be. So you're going to see it, you know, get brighter and darker as we go along. But all these layers, they just help to add kind of like weight to the piece. You know, gives it depth, because the layers will build up, and to a certain extent you always get to see the layers show through a bit, so it just adds more and more detail. Of course, until you add too many layers and then it wipes out the layers underneath, and you're actually, so I mean there's diminishing returns to adding more layers. Also, when painting on these highlights, remember that there is quite a big curve in the middle of this, so while the more prominent curves you want to be lighter than the ones in the shadows. So particularly that section there is quite a large flat area, and it is nice to have that on there because it will allow you to see a little bit of the text more clearly. So as you can see, this technique that I'm using is again, it's kind of similar to the how the armor's done. It's lots of small marks built up in layers, and it kind of gives a bit of texture to the whatever the material is. I'm going for sort of like a dirty paper or kind of look to it. Whereas if you're looking for that clean Games Workshop look, theirs is much bolder in how the marks are applied. You wouldn't do these kind of like little tiny marks and things like that. You just kind of use kind of quite thin coats and build it up very cleanly. So again, it depends what you're looking for, but in this case, it's, you know, I'm always thinking about that. I want to add you know, that gritty feel to this model. You can see every time when I apply the next layer, I'm still only using Ushabti bone, but even though it's still the same colour, it's creating highlights all the time when it goes over it, because it's because the Ushabti bone is quite thin, and it's not a fantastically great paint for coverage anyway, so multiple layers of it is slowly creating more opacity, but making those highlight areas brighter. So I'll just keep adding more and more. So it's still, you're making it lighter and lighter. And so at this stage, I'm looking at it and thinking, when I put the text on, is it going to be visible? And that dark area in the middle there, or in fact, like all the dark areas really on it, they're going to make the text really hard to see, which isn't too bad in some areas, because you want it to kind of fade in and out as it goes into the shadows, but you definitely want to be able to see the text quite visibly in some sections. So, but the problem with that flat area is that it kind of curves backwards a little bit, so it should be more in shadow. That's why I painted it in shadow to start with, but you've got to kind of balance it with making the text visible on it. Now you can see that the transitions aren't perfect, so they're kind of like almost scratchy on it, and I'm fine with that, because again it's adding a bit of texture to it. You don't always want perfectly smooth looking transitions and everything, especially not if you want them to look kind of worn and ragged. So don't always, you don't have to paint everything on a model with perfectly smooth transitions. I mean, if you want to do that and that's a specific look you're going for, that's fine, but always be aware that you want to create contrast on a model, not just in colours and tones, but on materials like soft and hard, rough and smooth, things like that. And in this case, it's a case of matte to shiny with the armour, and obviously you've got light and dark as well with the black and the white scroll, purity seal, sorry. So now we're going to paint on the text. Now this, you have to be very, very careful. It's just a case of making very, very, very tiny marks. Well, this is how I like to do text anyway. As I mentioned, I like the text to be very, very small, just kind of almost like Morse code, dots and dashes. But you want the dots, the marks in general, just to be as small as you can. And you'll need the paint, the consistency of the paint is actually one of the biggest issues. If you get the paint too thin, it won't make a mark, and also risks kind of pooling, and that'll be really bad, because you won't be able to make a strong mark, and it will probably be too big as well, because it'll blob. If the paint's too thick, it might not make a mark, or if it does make a mark, it might be a very strong mark. Now you might think, well, a strong mark's good, but a strong mark is much more visible, whereas if it's a kind of a soft small mark, it's less visible and gives the impression that it's smaller than it is. Now, to counteract some of that, I will be glazing over the whole thing a little bit afterwards. But you can see, so I think I've actually used a smaller brush at this stage. It might be a 00. Again, it doesn't matter as long as you've got a good point, but it might help just to focus you in a bit, to have a brush that's small all the way to the point rather than just having the point itself. Also, when applying the text, so you might think, it's not level. The text is level with the top of the top of the purity seal. Now, the purity seal kind of folds and bends in funny angles all the way down. They're not horizontal angles, but you have to keep the text horizontal all the way down, so it's in line with the previous line. So it'll cross over and cross through some of these folds. So just be aware of that. Don't just try and follow the shape of the material, because it will then look wrong when it's finished. It might seem a bit strange while you're actually painting it, because you're going straight through details, but when it's finished, it'll all come together and look correct. Now, it does look like in the video like I'm hardly making any mark, but they are there and they are small. If you wanted to go insane, there are people that will try and paint almost like small real words on their scroll work. They're a little bit bigger because they have to be, just to get the shapes down. Again, I've mentioned him before. If you look at Gareth Nicholas's work, he does very fine purity seals. In fact, there was a model that he posted the other day that I saw that had got some purity seals on that were really nicely done with loops and curls and all sorts of things like that on the text. But as I mentioned, you have to paint it a little bit bigger just to get that in, whereas I was just going for a very, very fine, tiny marks to represent more true scale, or closer to true scale. You can't really paint it small enough for a proper scale text, but I think you understand what I mean. Make sure you just use the very tip of the brush as well. Don't be tempted to try and do a long line and use the side of the brush, because it'll make the mark thicker. It might be, and I did consider doing this myself, but I was just too lazy to do it. So quite often on purity seals, if you look at a lot of Games Workshop stuff, at the very top of the purity seal or scroll or whatever it is that you're doing, there'll be a large letter, probably in red. It might be in a box. And it just makes it look a bit more interesting. Sometimes I think they even do like little daggers or a skull or whatever, a little symbol at the beginning, but it's a lot bigger than the rest of the text, and it can add a bit of just a nice bit of flavour to the piece. I probably should have done it really, but again, if you go and use a little bit of reference on how they do it sometimes, it is a lot easier if you're doing their clean style to do something like that. If you're doing this kind of worn look, then again, any details that you paint become much harder to see, just because the dark areas and all the stains and things that are mixed in with all the text. So just saw there, actually I'd got a little bit too much paint on the brush. The amount of paint on the brush is very important. Again, you have to run it on your thumb or whatever you use to get the thick of the paint off. I say it quite a lot, but in this case it is extremely important, because you're doing such small marks. If you touch the purity seal and you haven't rubbed the paint off, and the paint is a little tiny bit thin, it will pull massively. You can see some of the marks there. It's incredibly fine balance. I was doing this a bit quick. I probably should have taken my time a bit more, but you can go back and tweak these text bits if you want. Because you just go and use the Ushabti bone, and just go over neaten up the little marks a bit. So you see a few of those that I've made are too thick and have blobbed a little bit. So this is where it might be easier if you're left-handed and not recording it for a camera to try and allow people to see what you're doing. So the problem is that obviously it goes into the edge of the upper layer of the purity seal. So you have to be very careful not to catch that edge, because again it'll be a mistake. On the plus side, it's a very small amount of work that you have to do on the second layer of the purity seal, because obviously it's only a small area that's visible. And so also when you're painting from the edges in, leave a small gap. If you paint up to the very edge with the text and go in, you're destroying the defining edge of the material, so it'll just not look as good. So here you can see I'm just picking out some of the ones that are a bit harder to get when painting from the outside in. And again, it's not a big deal to paint from inside out, but you just got to be aware that you want a very definite start point at the side of each piece of text. So it's kind of hard to see in the video there, but there are just lots of little marks on the purity seal. So here, just off screen, what I've done is made up a quick wash using Rhinox hide. Not a wash, it's a glaze. Oh, it's the same thing until you apply it. So I've just put a small amount on the brush, wiped it off with some kitchen roll. I'm now fading in and just putting some stains in the shadows, just to help blend in some of the text work and things like that, make it look a bit more dirty. This is where you pay more attention again to the curves in, because you're using a glaze, so you can be a bit more brave with how you apply it, so you can go over some of the highlighted areas a little bit. But it also allowed me to just kind of re-emphasize that curve that goes inward, so it'd be more shadowed. Because it's a glaze, you can still see the text showing through, but it's making it darker at the same time. And now I'm just going to go and use the Ushabti bone and tidy up a few areas and just pick out a few points to make it look more interesting again. And here I'm using some Ceramite white. Be very, very sparing with the Ceramite white. It's a big jump in tonal contrast from especially the shadowed areas. This is just to pick out, the very close edges, like prominent edges, sorry. And don't put the whole edge in white or anything like that. It's purely to pick out details. If you really need to redefine the edges a little bit, then just go back to the Ushabti bone. And there we are, and there's a photo with that's a little bit clearer so you can see it. It's not quite as messy as it looked in the video. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.